Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us for today's program. We are very excited to be talking about some of our founding figures of the local scene, founding figures of Ybor. My name is Lisa. I'm with the Tampa Hillsborough County Public Library, and I'm joined today by our friend Henry Valenti from the Tampa Bay History Center. Mr. Valenti is going to be telling us all about these two founding figures and some more of the early days of Ybor City. Mr. Valenti, thank you so much for joining us today. So folks at home, as we go along, remember you can type those questions in any time during the program. We will be keeping an eye on the chat box there. We'll be seeing your questions as they come in. And towards the end of the program, we will have time set aside for that Q&A where we'll ask Mr. Valenti all of your great questions. So remember, just type those into the chat box anytime, and we will definitely get to them before the end. And with all of that out of the way, Mr. Valenti, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening. As you've heard, my name is Henry, and I'm a longtime docent at the Tampa Bay History Center. I'm going to be talking about two people that were very significant in the development of not only Ybor City in the very, very early days, like before 1900, and pretty close to like 1885. One of them you're going to be very familiar with. His name is part of the city, or the suburb of Ybor City that we know very well here in the Tampa Bay area. Another one is one that I discovered during my research about writing some of these presentations and researching them. And this was something that was written by Tony Pizzo. And if you've never heard him, you ought to look him up, because Tony was a really early amateur historian that lived in Ybor City, and he's written quite a bit of firsthand knowledge about the community and the people and his relationships to it that is very interesting. So the first thing I want to talk about, just to give you my circumstance in this, is the two people you're looking at right now are my grandparents. They are Juan Sanchez and Concha Orusti Sanchez. They both came around 1907 to the United States from Spain. My grandfather was from Galicia, and my grandmother was from Asturias. And they came here at 15 for my grandfather and 14 years of age for my grandmother. My grandfather worked in the cigar industry as a roller. He was such a good roller that he really was all his life worked in rolling the very expensive cigars in the factories of Ybor City. My grandmother was also a roller, but as time went on and they became mechanized, sometime in the 30s, she became a machine operator that were making more cigars, but probably the ones that were less expensive than the really expensive cigars. And the class of cigars at that time ranged quite a bit from very, very cheap, like maybe, you've always heard the term, I'd like to have a good 5-cent cigar. Well, that was about the range that it started at and went very high from there. So I lived with these two grandparents starting when I was born in 1944 and not moving until I was 13 years old. So I was with them all the way through elementary school and part of junior high school or middle school. And my schooling and where I was raised was in the immigrant communities of Ybor City and Palmetto Beach, and went to school in some very old schools that were called DeSoto, Philip Shore, and also Jefferson, the old Jefferson High School. I'm going to go to the next slide. So these are the two gentlemen I'm talking about today, and they really had an amazing impact. Of course, the one on the left is Mr. Vicente Martínez Ybor, and Ybor City is named after him. He came in 1885 and started the cigar industry in Tampa. Next to him is somebody that Tony Pizzo called the man lost to history, because he was a person that had such a significant impact, but nobody knew about him. They knew about Mr. Ybor, but they didn't know anything about Manrara. And when I ran across him, I was really amazed at the influence that he had along with Ybor in developing Ybor City and making Tampa into an industrial behemoth in the South. And so I'm going to be talking about those two. Just a little background on those two gentlemen. Excuse me. Mr. Ybor was born in Spain, in Seville, at the age of 15, his parents decided to move him from Spain to Cuba, and Cuba at that time was a territory of Spain, because there was wars going on in Spain, and that he would be eligible for being drafted, and to try to avoid that, they decided to send him to Cuba to avoid it. He started off, he came from well-to-do parents, because it was only well-to-do parents that were able to do that, probably upper middle class. And he came to Cuba probably at the same age that my grandfather came here at 15 years old. He started very low, but became a broker right away as a young man, and started working as a broker for the cigar factories in that area, and brokering cigars that he would buy from them. And he learned a lot about the cigar industry, and was doing so well that he decided to start his own cigar company while he was over there, and did establish his cigar industry in Cuba at a very young age. The other man, Manrara, was a younger man who was born in Cuba. He was taught in Cuba and became working in banking. And Ybor met Manrara at some point in his time when he had already opened his factory. So Mr. Ybor was born in Valencia, Spain in September 7th, 1818. He moved to Cuba at 14 and to avoid military service, as I said, and mostly started working as a clerk in grocery stores, but began selling cigars, Havana cigars manufactured in Cuba. At 35 years old, he started his own cigar factory called El Príncipe de Gales, which is known as the Prince of Wales cigars. Eduardo Manrara was born in Puerto Príncipe in Cuba in 1842. He was 24 years younger than than Ybor, and met Ybor in Havana probably somewhat prior to the 10 Years' War with Spain. He had a talent in finance and commerce and rapport, and one of the important things that he was able to do for Ybor, who spoke Spanish his whole life, was being an interpreter for Ybor in all of their dealings that they had, so that he was the person that was able to deal directly with the Anglo leadership of Tampa at the time in all the business dealings that they did with them and others in that area. So Ybor began his factories in 1853 to 1885. And in that period, there was a revolutionary movement that was known as the 10 Years' War. The Spanish people were, the Cuban people were trying to gain their freedom from Spain. And in the process, there was a war that lasted 10 years. And it started with El Grito de Yara, where the signal was given to start off the war. At that time, probably within a year of the start of the war, Mr. Ybor sort of favored the side of the revolutionaries trying to gain their freedom from Spain. And the reason he did this was a couple of them. One is there was a tax put on Spain on not raw products, excuse me, finished products like cigars to try to get their share of money out of the produce from and the goods and services that they tried to get hold of while they were the overseers of Spain, of Cuba. So the tax really hurt the Cuban manufacturers, and especially in the cigar industry. And so for that reason, he was supporting letting Cuba become independent from Spain. He also had an instinct and a light for his workers. And so he also was very, very conscientious about their need for freedom and sort of favored that also. As the 10-year war began, his sympathies with the workers began to show, and the overseers of Havana at the time that were part of the Spanish government started noticing at that. He was giving money to the revolution and also encouraging his workers and people to get involved in it. And that was in the beginning of 1869. As they found out, they became concerned about that, and then he sort of became a wanted man in Havana. And for his safety and to protect his investments, he left very, very early in the war and moved his cigar factory to Calla Hueso, which was known then, which was Key West, which was known then as Calla Hueso. He made it over there and started his factory. He brought over his son and Eduardo to help him out by 1872, and made them part of his factory over there and his firm. By 1885, there was continued strife, and that was a problem because the strife also made it impossible to keep productivity up in the cigar industries. So he was concerned about that. On top of the other things, there was a lot of problems with being in Key West. One, there's no natural water in Key West. The only way you get water is by catching it in cisterns from rainwater. So that was always a problem. But the other problem is he had big ideas at that time of what he wanted to do with the cigar industry and his part in it. And so there was not room for expansion over there. And the other problem there was that whenever there was labor issues between the cigar manufacturers and the workers could very easily move back to Cuba and work over there until the strike was over. And because they were able to work, that always extended the strikes and made them longer. So in 1885, he was looking for a place to go and expand his fortune, and also to a place in the United States where he could avoid the taxes that he had to pay for bringing products into the United States, and also be able to be in a position to produce them and expand his vision. So this all started with something that was a search for guavas. And that's the peninsula of Tampa. The word was out at that time that there were a lot of guavas in Ybor City, or not Ybor City at the time, in Tampa. And there were two men that were stationed in New York at the time. They were Gavino Gutierrez and Bernardino Gargol. Gargol was a jam maker whose products were made in Cuba, but he stayed a lot in New York to promote his products and try to sell them throughout the States at that time. Gavino Gutierrez, as a young man, lived in New York and had business interests in New York and training as an engineer. He spent time in Cuba from 1868 at age 19 and then moved to New York at 19. Gardeau met Gutierrez while he was living in New York or visiting over there. He traveled back and forth between Cuba and Spain and New York, and they became good friends. So they decided to travel together to the Tampa Bay area because they had heard the rumor also about the possibility of guavas being over there in big groves. So they moved to Tampa. Next. They found very few guava trees. This was Tampa at the time. When you look at it, it was not a big place. They had like maybe 800 people living in Tampa. They had very little paved roads. The city was not very big, and they had just gotten a railroad that Mr. Henry B. Plant had brought into Tampa in 1883. And they had all just discovered phosphate in East Tampa and a little bit of industry of raising cattle and shipping it to Cuba. But other than that, there was not a lot of industry going on. There were very few people living there, and land was cheap. So they traveled over there, probably arrived by what was known as a ferry that went from Cuba to Tampa and also other stops in New Orleans and Galveston and Mobile, and then back to Cuba again. So they took the ferry and went into Tampa. They probably played, the only hotel that was there at the time was the Henry B. Plant Hotel, and that's probably where they stayed. Gutierrez, even though they could not find anything, was enchanted with Tampa and its wildlife. You know, it was a fisherman's and hunter's dream world, and he was very he was quite a fisherman and also quite a hunter, and enjoyed that part of Tampa. Although they didn't find any guava trees, they thought that Tampa had some position over there where they could be very important to anybody that wanted to start anew in this very little village. They had like I said, they had the railroad. They had a great bay that could be made into a port, and they had a lot of land that was very cheap at the time. So on their travels, they decided to stop in Havana and speak to their friend Ybor. Gutierrez had known Ybor for quite a while because, because Ybor had a factory in New York City at the time also. But it was a problem because New York City was very dry, and for doing a really good Havana cigar, which was made with Havana leaf, which was probably the premier leaf that cigar workers liked to smoke at the time, you needed a humid and warm climate, and Tampa sure had enough of that. So they stopped, they talked to Ybor, and in the conversation they had to him, they mentioned Tampa because he had mentioned to them that he was looking for some space to move to in the United States. And especially Gutierrez was very effusive about, you really should go to Tampa. Land is cheap. It's very open country. There's a lot of opportunity for anybody over there, and they've got a railroad and a very nice port and a big bay that can be developed even more as a port city. So immediately, in the September of 1885, he decided to go with another cigar owner over there that was known as Ignacio Aya. And right now in Ybor City, we actually have a new hotel that was named after him. Ignacio Aya went to to Tampa to investigate the area. They met with the city fathers at that time, which were involved in a group that would be the Chamber of Commerce later on. But it was a local group of the businessmen in that town. And if you can see, right about to the right in an open space, more to the right and down, you can see a railroad track down below, but it's 40 acres. That's what Ybor City was up other. That was Ybor City at the time. Of course, there was no Ybor City there. It was mostly scrub and pine trees. But he managed to buy 40 acres of land that's probably somewhere in the vicinities of what we consider to be around 15th Street and 20th, bordered by 22nd Street on 15th Street, probably bordered by about 20th Street in the north. So he bought 40 acres, and Aya, along with him, later on would buy right across from his acreage a plot of land where he would build his factory. He negotiated with the city fathers at the time, and they were asking for $9,000 for the 40 acres. He said, that's too much. I'll only pay $5,000. And they said, I'm sorry, that's the price that is going, so you'll have to pay that. And he said, okay, well then I'll go someplace else, and walked out. And they all looked at each other, realizing what an opportunity they were missing since they had no industry in Tampa whatsoever, to let this man go that was going to try to open a factory that would probably start off with like about 1,500 workers in the factory itself, and trying to lure others. So he had the good fortune of not walking very fast, and they caught up with him and said, wait a minute, maybe we can make a deal. And they told him, look, you come up with the 5,000 and we will come up with 4,000. But if you put it all up yourself, we will pay you later on and give you back the 14,000 to get at the price that you want. So he said, fine, that's good. So he moved on. Went back to Cuba, he and Aya, and they talked to their local people over there and said, we think this is a good idea. Let's move over there. They all agreed with him. And so he and Aya made passage and whatever else that they needed to be able to head over there, and immediately started building wooden factories. You can see Mr. Ybor's factory on the right that he later on gave to an educational institute that they had in Ybor City after he built his other factory. And they used that as an education building for the Lycea. Mr. Sanchez, Mr. Aya had a partner named Sanchez, and he opened the Sanchez and Aya factory right across the street from Mr. Ybor. And they both went on to produce cigars right away. It didn't take long to get those factories finished, so that by January of 1986, they prepared to start production at the same time. Now, whoever got the first cigar out was going to be designated as cigar factory number 1. And of course, they were both racing to try to make cigar factory number 1. Unfortunately, there's two stories going. One is that Mr. Aya was smart and that he got tobacco leaves that were already stripped. There's a vein in the middle of a big tobacco leaf that needs to be taken out of the leaf, and they can't use it. And so he ordered his tobacco leaf from Havana already stripped. So that saved him some time. But there's another story also that Mr. Ybor tried to put a Spaniard in as a foreman in his office when they first started. And there was always contentious attitudes between the Spaniards and the Cubans because the Spaniards had run things in Cuba, and the Cubans didn't like that and were trying to gain their freedom. So they would prefer to have a supervisor that was Cuban. And so they sort of had a small strike for a moment which also set him back. I don't know which was more important, but I've heard two stories on this, and I'm going that probably neither one of them helped out Mr. Ybor in getting out the first cigar. And so Mr. Aya put out the first cigar out the front door of his factory, and he was designated as factory number 1. And Mr. Ybor became factory number 2. So here we are in Ybor City, about what it looks like right now. Mr. Ybor's factory is still functional, not as a cigar factory anymore. A religious organization has bought it and serves as their office space for the Tampa Bay area. And but he started building a brick factory right away, and it was built on the corner of 8th Avenue and 15th Street. And at the time was probably the largest brick building in the state of Florida. It is currently 4 stories high. There's more buildings around it. You can go to Ybor City on the corner of 15th Street and 8th Avenue, and you can see the factory that he built facing 15th Street with a big iron staircase going up. Mr. Aya's factory burnt down or was moved, and he moved to another one. I can't remember exactly where that was, but he also built a brick cigar factory that was in Ybor City, but not right across the street from Ybor at the time. So those edifices were built and cigar factories started being produced. Now, Mr. Ybor was an entrepreneur of his age, and he had grand ideas. Well, first of all, they had a problem that they had to deal with, which also became quite prosperous and profitable for him. There were 800 people living in Ybor City, as I said. And of those 800 people living in Tampa at the time, not a one of them knew how to roll cigars. So the first thing they had to do was import cigar rollers, and the best cigar rollers in the world came from Havana. So they started importing people. There was a fortunate thing that happened in favor of Mr. Ybor and Mr. Manrara at the time. They were both doing business in Key West, and they had a big fire in Key West right when their factories opened. And so that put a lot of cigar rollers and factory workers out of a job for a while, because it was, when fires happen in places, and they happened in Ybor City and places like Key West, a lot of the buildings were made of wood and they spread rapidly. And so they never turned out to be just small fires. They spread, there were houses built so close to that, they just jumped from one to the others, and the fires became raging fires through whole communities at the time. A number of factories burned down, and so they were able to get workers from Key West to come to Tampa right away to start working in the factories. But the other problem they had, beside the lack of workers, is they had no place to put them. And so the first industry they got into with Mr. Manrara and Ybor was the Ybor City Land and Improvement Company. And what the Land and Improvement Company did is they started buying up property all around Ybor City. Mr. Ybor was shrewd. He could afford the $9,000. He had quite a bit of money. And by saving the $5,000, he was able to buy more land all around Ybor City. And what he did with the Manrara, with the land company, is they started building what they call little casitas. They were like very small houses. They called them shotgun houses because you could get to the front door and shoot a shotgun for the front door, and it went all the way out the back door without hitting anything. So you would usually walk in and there would be a living room, then the next room would be a bedroom, and then the next room would be a kitchen kind of area. And also a lot of the kitchens were indoor and outdoor. And also the privy was outdoor at the time. They later on moved them in, but people had outhouses. So there was no bathrooms inside of them. So he was building these things quite rapidly. Oh, I forgot to tell you, the other side of my family was Sicilian, and they came from Sicily in 1905, a little bit before my Spanish grandfathers. And he was a carpenter. I think he worked in the cigar industry a little bit, but he went into carpentry right away with the building that was going on in Ybor City and built a lot of those casitas and some of the larger houses in Ybor City, along with his brother, who was a contractor at the time. So that was the first enterprise that they went into, with Manrara as the president of Ybor City Land and Improvement Company. And they were doing very well with that. They also hired local people to work in the land company. And Mr. Peter O'Knight, who was one of our founders, was part of one of the people that worked as their vice president for the land company. So the first thing they got into was very smart. Mr. Ybor and Manrara started putting out the word to Key West and also to Cuba, because of the turmoil that was going on, that he would invite them to move a cigar factory to Tampa. And in exchange for them doing that, he would build them a factory with no charge for the first 10 years of their existence there. But they had to guarantee him a certain amount of people that they could bring over. So that was part of the land company deal, where they would build other factories over there. He was not afraid of competition. This was a company town, but it wasn't owned by one company. It was more like an industry town, where Ybor City's main industry were the manufacturing of cigars and the ancillary things that had to go along with it, like box factories, restaurants, the building of homes, and all of that. And so this was a one industry net town, but not a one company town. So there was competition in there for workers to make life slightly better, or quite a bit better than what you actually got in what company towns were normally like in other places in the United States. So that's what was their main function at the time, and they were doing very well at that. The second thing he said, well, if I have other factories over here, they're going to need to get the raw products that they need, which was the cigar leaf, up to the factories at Ybor City, because it was like 3 miles away from where boats came in and docked on the Hillsborough River at the base of the city. And they're going to need a way to get the product back down there to ship it out. So the first thing he did was built this small gauge railroad system in 1886, and charged, of course, the owners of other cigar factories to bring their product in or to bring their product out. But along with it, he also charged any passengers that wanted to go from Ybor City to the city downtown, and also from the city downtown back up to Ybor City. Not anything expensive. I think it was a modest 5 cents per trip. So he did that, and that was also very fruitful for him. Along with the land company, he also, in 1887, started the Ybor City Building and Loan Association. You can see a little bit of the casitas. They also had some bigger houses and some two-story houses, because along with families that were coming into Ybor City and living in the casitas, they had a lot of single men that needed a place to live. So a lot of the two-story houses were rooming houses that the single men workers could go to and get room and board over there while they worked in the factories. Here's a typical picture of what a factory looked like at the time. As you can see, the work was very quiet, and that becomes very important later on because they work with their hands. They had one tool that was called a chaveta, which was a curved knife that they used to trim the leaf. And they worked in these tables. I'm not going to go too much into the culture they built, but I have to say one thing is, like, they brought something over from Cuba that was very unique. Because the work was very quiet, they had what they call lectores. And the lectores would read to the workers while they work. And they were very important to the education and the unity of the working people in there. Now, you have to understand that it was not only Cubans that was coming in, Sicilians came in from probably mostly from one valley called the Magazzoli Valley in Sicily. They had been working in Louisiana and also around Orlando, building the railroad and also in the cane fields. And you also had Spaniards that came also from Cuba that usually they got the better jobs in the factory. And so you had a conglomeration of three nationalities in there that if they were in Europe, they would be at each other's throats. You also had some Afro-Cubans that was working in the factory at the same time with working people. You would not see that anyplace else in the United States in an industrial site. And very shortly, also women were working in there, not at first doing rolling, but they later on did become rollers, but starring in lower jobs, just like the Sicilians started in lower jobs. But one of the things that brought them together was the lectore, and the lectore would read to them from their daily newspapers and from union tracts and organizing tracts, and also international papers that had to do with the political issues of the time concerning working people. And then in the afternoons, he would read them novels that usually had to do with working class issues, like writers like Victor Hugo and Cervantes and others that were writing about the issues of the day for working people. So in May of 16, he got into the banking business. He opened up the Exchange National Bank. And by the way, that bank was still in Tampa when I was growing up in Tampa. And in the early 60s, we had our first skyscraper, which was the Exchange National Bank, which is the first skyscraper to go up in Tampa in all time. It was the tallest building when I was growing up that we had over there. The Exchange Bank did business giving loans out to not only the employees that needed them to buy houses, but also they needed it for the payrolls in other cigar factories. And so he was doing very well within, and as in other areas of the time that they were opening up business, they always tried to incorporate local businessmen and local Anglo elite in Tampa to make sure that they had their favor as they were going along. Oh, that's a box factory on the right-hand side that was built very closely to when that was built, and the people that work. You can see there were a lot of women working in that box factory. Again, an unusual sight to have men and women working together in an industrial site in that time and age in the United States. So a gas company got organized. Now, Manrara and Ybor didn't do this. And again, you have to consider that Ybor was more concerned about the cigar industry and getting and propagating other people coming into Tampa and building factories there, because he was making more money. The more factories we had doing business with him and doing the businesses that he started, the more money he made. The gas company was started by organizing by A.J. Boardman and Frank Bruin of Minneapolis, with Manrara being the heaviest investor. And the first president was Peter O'Knight, another elite person and one of the founding fathers of Tampa at the time, were members of this company. So here's the pride and joy of Ybor City, and it's still standing, by the way. This is the Ybor City Brewing Company, known as the Florida Brewing Company. It was built in 1897, and it was the major exporter of beer to Cuba at the time, and also provided beer for most of Florida at the time. It was the only brewery in Florida. So if you wanted beer, you would be drinking Florida, you would be drinking Florida Brewing Company beer, or you would be getting it either from Alabama or Georgia. Not as good. And this was also organized by the vision of Ybor and organized by Manrara. Manrara became the first president, and the capital stock of the building and other things was $200,000 at the time. Go on to the next sketch. Actually, this is a good picture of Ybor's factory, right where the people are gathered. On your right-hand side of the people that were gathered in front is Ybor's factory. And on the left-hand side, right across the street, is his land company that's on the left-hand side of the street. To the front, and you can just see one pillar, was one of the famous buildings they had in Tampa that was called La Pasaje. That was built as a hotel and club for the elite Latinos that were in the factory owners, but also a lot of the Anglo elite also liked going over there, and it was strictly like a men's club where a lot of things went on that they didn't want their families to know about. So it was a good restaurant and a good club, and it's a beautiful building. Still across the street from Ybor's factory, and what you see there is what you will see if you go to 8th Avenue and 15th Street. The land company looks quite different. It's still there, but it at first was sold and became a clinic for the Latin community that had clinics that were run by the mutual aid societies, and was a clinic for a long time, and then later on actually became the Don Vicente, which was sort of like a boutique rooming house, hotel, and restaurant. It's no longer there. As a matter of fact, I don't think there's very much in that building anymore. They haven't decided what they're going to do with it. That was pretty popular in the 80s. So one of them, by this time in 1899, Ybor had already passed away, and his first son had passed away. Let me go back a little bit because I wanted to give you the dates on those things because they're pretty fun. Ybor's son, oldest son, died in 1892, who was playing a big part of the factory. And Ybor died in 1896. At that point, Manrara took over the factory and was running the Ybor's industries all by himself, along with the land and improvement company at that time. So he ran into trouble. Manrara considered himself to be a man of the times. You know, he was really into the industrialization of the United States and trying to rationalize labor and the factories so that they would become more productive. And he really got into that a lot, which caused him a problem in 1899. This incident was called the Wait Strike of July 1899. And what it revolved around is to try to rationalize industry. He was going to start weighing the cigar leaf that came in bulk and what came out as a cigar, so that he could track out how much was waste or how much was going away. The problem with that is that they had a tradition among the cigar rollers that they were entitled to whatever little cigar leaf was left over on their table at the end of the day that they could take home with them, because a lot of them would roll cigars for their own use, or they would roll cigars to be able to sell to their friends and neighbors to make a little bit extra money. So this is a tradition that was very important to the working class that was working in the factories. The minute they saw this new program coming in of the weights that were going to be in there, they understood what that meant to them, that there was going to be probably a lot of a crackdown on their traditional ability to take out a little bit of what was left over at the end of the day. So they went on strike. It was called La Huelga de la Pesa, which means the weight strike. Anyway, this was the first major strike where almost everybody walked out of the factories at the time because it meant a lot to them. It meant something to their pocketbooks. It meant something to their pride. It meant something to the traditions of being an artisan as a cigar roller. And so this was not a little thing to the workers. And so they went on strike. And here's the thing about the strike. They were actually only asking for one thing, is that they left that alone. But as the strike went on, they enlarged what they were demanding of the cigar dons at the time. And so they stayed out for quite a long time. The owners of the factories finally had to give up because of the unity that was involved in the strike. And this was the first strike that they won, the first strike ever, and the first strike that they won, but it was also the last strike they would ever win. And they went on quite a few more, about every 10 years, starting with 1901, 1910, 1920, ending in 1931. The cigar workers at that time would go on strike with major strikes, general strikes, with almost all the cigar factories emptying out every 10 years for some issue that was going on. That brought a lot of what I call vigilante justice for the elites of the Anglo class at that time in Tampa. I've also written a PowerPoint presentation on those strikes, because they were very significant to the unity, and very significant to the workers' ability to organize and improve their lives. The cigar workers were one of the highest paid by records of any working class factories or industries in the whole United States at the time. There was another thing that was going on at that time, and that was a trust. Because they lost the strike, Manrara at that time said, we need to get more unity among the different cigar workers so we can meet these workers, with a unified front, because we just fell apart in the first strike that ever happened. And so he instituted the Manrara Havana Trust. And it was made up of the cigar industries in almost all the cigar factories in Tampa, and a few that were in places like Jacksonville and Ocala. But the trust had an assets of $10 million at the time. At the same time that the Havana Trust was established, probably a name that you're familiar with, is a guy named the Duke family, or the Mr. Duke, opened up the American Tobacco Trust. He was making cigarettes in the South and using American cigar leaf, cigarette leaf for making the cigarettes in the South in the United States. His trust was worth $500 million. He didn't like the fact that he had to constantly be competing with the Havana cigar industry in Tampa, and it was taking away from the cigarette industry that he had in the South. And by the way, they were both fighting with each other, and the cigarette industry was one of the big reasons that the cigar industry died in Tampa. But I'm not going to go into that, because that's another story. But anyway, eventually what happened is that Duke took over the Havana Trust and bought it out, and he became the owner of it, and that put Mr. Manrara into retirement. He spent a lot of time in New York at the time, where his wife used to like to stay, but he did come back to Tampa on many occasions, and stayed at El Pasaje. But he traveled back and forth. But one thing he did do in 1901 is he drove the first horseless carriage into the city of Tampa and it was the first, so they called it the horseless carriage at the time, and drove it down Ybor City Street, scaring all the horses that were around and amazing the people that saw this carriage going by with no horses in front of it. And so he became famous for driving the first horseless carriage in Tampa in 1901. He later died in New York City, just a few years later after driving in there. You can see it in 1990. I can't remember the date that he died, but it wasn't too much longer. You know, he died in New York City with his family around him. If you go on the Riverwalk, our brand new Riverwalk in Tampa, there's two honorees on the Riverwalk. One is Vicente Martínez Ybor and Gavino Guterres, who later became he was an engineer and became the man who platted out Ybor City for Mr. Martínez Ybor at the time, and built a number of those brick buildings that you see on 7th Avenue. He was the designer and engineering, and actually built one for himself also in Ybor City that's on 7th Avenue at the time. So Manrara still remains a man that's lost to history because he never got his bus established on the Riverwalk as one of the founders of Ybor City and all that it became between 1900 and 1931. By the way, 1931 was the demise of the cigar industry, slowly but surely, to the point that by the 1950s and going into the 60s, they went from like 250 cigar factories making, at the height of the industry, 500 million cigars a year and employing like close to 20,000 workers to having like 2 factories and now only 1. And the industry only employing about 8,000 workers by World War II. So that was my time, and it's now over. So I'm leaving it up to you. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer.
All right, folks. Thank you so much, Mr. Henry. That was some really interesting history. I love that we had our very early Florida man wreaking havoc on the roads of Ybor. That was a fun nugget. So, folks, if you haven't already, remember to type in your questions in the chat box. We would love to ask our subject matter expert here while we have him on the line. So if you have any questions on this topic, go ahead and get those typed into the chat box.
Or anything else that comes to your mind about Ybor City.
Exactly. if it's Ybor, or even if it's tangentially related, throw it in there. We'll see if we can't get that answered. I've got Tampa Bay History Center's information up on the screen if you wanted to look at more of their programs and events that they have coming up. TampaBayHistoryCenter.org is the website. And if you want to look at some fun pictures of Old Town Ybor and Old Tampa, we have that wonderful Burgett Brothers photographic collection.
I use that a lot.
Yeah, we had some of those photos in this presentation as well. So if you want to find more of those, come to the John F. Germany Public Library downtown and browse that collection, or scan that code there. hcplc.org/research will get you to that link where you can browse that online or see it in person. So let's see if we have any questions coming in yet. Don't be shy, folks. There's no question too big or too small. If you think of a question after the program, you can reach the library at hcplc.org/contact. Give us a call, 813-273-3652. So I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box here. I think our folks are maybe they don't want to be the first one to raise their hands. So I noticed that we didn't have a lot of pictures of Manrara. We had the one that was him with the vehicle, right? With the car.
And the opening shots of Ybor, and the man next to him was Manrara.
That's him as well.
Manrara.
So are those the only 2 photos that we know of?
We have more. I didn't get to show a lot of because I wanted to show more of what was going on in Ybor City at the time. You know?
Sure. I was curious. Since he didn't get a bust on the Riverwalk, I was like, well, maybe they just don't have enough angles of his face.
No, I think that might be a problem. They don't have a lot of pictures
Yeah.
of him, but they have enough that I think they could have made a bust, as you can see from that first picture. That was a pretty good picture. They could have made one from that.
So folks, here's your chance. Maybe we'll have to start in a write-in campaign to get him added to the Riverwalk. All right, I see some folks have started typing away already, so keep those questions coming in. What is your favorite era of early Ybor history?
Well, I know a lot of the history because I joined as a docent after and I've been there for almost 10 years now. When I first retired. And I've always loved Ybor City because it was just such a unique place, But I was raised in the 50s, and Ybor City in the 50s was still a very exciting place.
Yes.
All the buildings were there. We still had a lot of the shops. There was actually, instead of just entertainment, there was German Jews and Serbian Jews, Romanian Jews, excuse me. That if you go look at Ybor City, there's Jewish names at the top of them, and there were a lot of Jewish families that were running dry goods stores.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, if you were born in the 50s and you wanted to buy a men's suit, you would go to Max Argentar. I bought my first suit over there.
Very dapper.
There was the Ritz Theater that you could go to on Saturday, and for 25 cents, you could spend the whole day there. You spent 14 cents to get in, you spent 10 cents for popcorn, and then you had 1 cent to buy. There would be a man outside selling saltwater taffy for a penny.
Now that's a treat.
You got to use your whole 25 cents and spend all the way from 12 o'clock to 4 o'clock over there. And you gave your family a rest and you entertained.
That is a built-in entertainment there for get the kids out of the house.
That's right.
So we have our first question here from the audience. They ask, are you familiar with the Wolf settlement in Ybor and Rosa Valdez helping to educate immigrant children during the early days?
I am. I've done a lot of study of the Wolf settlement. Matter of fact, when I was going to the University of South Florida, I managed to get a girlfriend over there, and she was working at the Wolf settlement at the time. So I used to go over there to pick her up, from work, and I got to know quite a bit of it personally. But then doing my researches on the different PowerPoint presentations that I created, that I also ran into a lot of things that talked about the Wolf settlement and their educational efforts. Into the 80s, they were still functioning and educating and it was mostly the black population at the time, because they were the ones with the littlest amount of money. But yeah, they were still going on at that time in the 80s. I think it's probably no longer there now.
Okay, interesting. We've got some more folks typing there, so we'll give them a chance to get those questions in. I have to say, I love this picture of your grandparents here. I'm just going to pull that up here in the background. You mentioned you got your first suit down there, and I'm wondering if these pictures here are from before or after they came to the U.S.
They came at 15. They're quite a bit older.
Okay, there. So these were definitely taken here locally then.
They wouldn't afford to take it in Cuba. Actually, my grandfather came from Spain at 15. He came from a peasant family. Then my grandmother was a little bit better off. Her uncle had opened a factory in Ybor City at the time, and she came to live with him because she was 14 and women didn't travel. But my grandfather came by himself, and he had very little money, and started working at 15 as soon as he could in the cigar factories. Luckily, there was a lot of jobs.
Yeah.
But he stopped in Cuba, and I still had some family in Cuba, but I don't want to get into politics. But unfortunately, with the new attitude we have about Cuba, I've lost touch with them. But I have a cousin over there still alive, so I think. He may not be, he's pretty old.
Well, it looks like your grandparents, just based on these fancy outfits they've got on, it looks like they end up doing pretty well for themselves.
Yeah, they dress well, and I've got more pictures like that. I'm always amazed. My grandfather played the violin, and I have a lot of pictures of him in his outfits where they went to socials and clubs and picnics at the time, and they had whole bands, and they would dress just as nice. And so they usually took family pictures on a regular basis. Even the pictures of my mother and my two aunts were dressed well, and were educated because they put a big, unlike my Sicilian family, part of the family that once they had sixth grade and could read and write, they took them out of school and put them to work. The Spanish side, in a lot of cases, in my family's case, is like they stress education. They wanted them to get a high school education and then later send them to business school.
Well, it looks like our person that had the question about the Valdez Center sounds like that is still something that is going on under it looks like a ministry that is running it now, and it says that Dick Greco graduated from that school when he was a young boy.
I don't know that much about the Valdez Center, but I do know that Dick Greco went to that school. There were some Catholic-oriented schools like OLPH that a lot of that generation went to, and some of my generation went to OLPH instead of Philip Shore, which is in Ybor City, or Jefferson, which is just on the outskirts of Ybor City.
Well, it looks like that wraps up our questions for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending and for asking those questions. Mr. Henry, thank you so much again for this great presentation. We always love to get our local Tampa Bay history in to the library. So folks, check your library calendars for virtual programs, for in-person programs, hcplc.org/events. Always have lots of good stuff coming up. So check that out, and we hope to see you again at a program soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
And thank you.